Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to the DSG Founders Conclave 2021. This edition is special as we've opened it up to consumer founders and investors outside our portfolio. This is an event tailor-made for consumer founders, and it's been a long time coming. The reason DSG was founded back in 2012 and pioneered early-stage consumer investing was because we felt consumer brands required a different philosophy and business building approach when compared to tech businesses. We've backed over 60 companies since then, and we hope to share our learnings, experiences, and tap into the best minds from across the world through the Founders Conclave platform. We have a power-packed schedule today and request you to stay tuned right till the end. To start things off, the first session is a fireside chat on building capital-efficient businesses, especially in a year where we've had a record number of unicorns in India. It's important to highlight that founders needn't always pursue the go big or go home trajectory. Building businesses in a capital-efficient manner is a viable alternative. And it's also an important reason why we think consumer brands need a differentiated approach. On that note, let me introduce our guest. He's someone who's as passionate about capital-efficient business building as we are. We have with us Jesse Pujji. Jesse Pujji is the founder and CEO of GatewayX, a holding company that builds, buys, and invests in companies that are driving the DTC landscape. Prior to GatewayX, Jesse spent over a decade as the CEO and co-founder of Ampush, a performance marketing business that worked with some of the world's biggest brands, including Uber, DoorDash, Peloton, and Dollar Shave Club. He is a world-class expert in performance marketing and customer acquisition, and he also runs a very popular Twitter thread on bootstrap businesses. Highly recommend following that series. And as you can tell from Jesse's breadth of interests and experiences, this will be a wide-ranging conversation. Throughout the conversation, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat window. I've allocated 15 minutes for Q&A. Jesse, welcome to the session. Absolute pleasure to have you with us, and thank you again for staying up so late.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Perfect. And we have a lot to cover, so let me just jump right in. Let's start with GatewayX. What led you to founding GatewayX after Ampush? And what is the vision for GatewayX?
Yeah, it's a great question. At Ampush, we help grow some of the largest D2C brands. And, we oftentimes would get involved when they're around $10 million in spend on an annual basis, looking to scale that to 50 million and maintain their economics. And it was a great experience. But one of the crazy things that we've noticed working with all these companies was how much capital they needed to grow, and the fact that they were using, they were always doing it, basically using all the money from VCs to grow their businesses and grow customer acquisition. And having done that a long time, I started to ask the question, I was like, why are they growing at 300% or 400%? If you put your Warren Buffett hat on, he said, is there anything really that different between Dollar Shave Club and Harry's and Gillette? Are there big moats in the business? And the answer was no, by and large, right? Generally speaking, there wasn't a ton of defensibility. Every now and again, there's a D2C business that for some specific reason has some unique defensibility where it makes sense for it to scale super fast. Uber's an example where I thought it did make sense in that case to put a lot of capital at scaling because of the network effects in that business. And I just kind of said, this kind of makes no sense to me. These guys, they're going to grow really fast. They're going to exit, of course, which is great for their investors and them. But then they go on to build pretty kind of mediocre businesses that have okay economics. And I started, knowing what I knew, I said, well, what if we pulled back on growth scale by 50%? And typically the economics don't get better. They don't get better linearly. They get better exponentially. Mm-hmm. And you can actually, I was like, I did some math on some of our clients' businesses, or even talked to their founders and said, what's going on? I said, well, how come nobody's growing this way? How come no one's taking 5 years to get to this place, but actually doing it where they're driving EBITDA? And everyone's kind of like, nobody wants to do that. They either want to kind of go big or go home, as you said. And I just got really curious about that. And I said, there's got to be something there that's big and meaningful. The other big thing is I think there was a lot of areas and niches where there just was nobody going after it with a sophistication level. You either had these mom and pops. An example of something that one of the concepts we're working on now is, vegetarian or vegan multivitamins. Like it's like not so big that a VC in the US would fund it, but it's, mom and pops are working on it, but nobody, there's somewhere in between there that we thought there was opportunities. And, the quick math obviously in the US is if you could get someone to pay $50 a month and you get about 100,000 subscribers, that's like a $50 to $100 million top line business. And I think it's a pretty good business if it's doing 20 to 25% EBITDA margins. And I said, what if we built a collection of those? And that was kind of mostly the strategy side of it. On the personal side, I thought I was building a tech company 10 years ago and, software company, and it turned into kind of more of a services business, which was fine. It's been a great, awesome ride. We've learned a ton, but there's a part of me that wanted to start owning these businesses and doing it for myself versus doing it for other people. So that was more on the personal side, led to getting Gateway X off the ground.
Got it. No, that's useful. And what got you started on the hugely popular Twitter thread? What were you hoping to achieve on bootstrap businesses?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing that, you mentioned. I have this funny, whenever I talk to entrepreneurs, whether they're venture funded or not, I always ask them, I'm like, so how many units do you have to sell to get to break even? And it's clear when I ask them that question that I am the only person, whatever you want to call me, luminary person, Twitter, whatever the hell I am, like investor. I'm the only person asking them that question. I go, and I've had more than, 20, 30% of those conversations. I'll get an email, 90 days later going, I'm so glad you asked me that question. I had never thought about it. And I started thinking about it, and now I actually don't need VC money, or I've decided I don't want to do that. And so it was very clear. I don't have any issues with VCs, by the way. Like, I'm not there's some people on Twitter and stuff that are like, screw it. I'm an LP in some VC funds. I think it's a great way of investing in certain types of businesses, but I want there to be more discussion around bootstrapping as a way of financing, but also as just a way of running a business. And I think one of the nice things about being a bootstrap in your mindset is like, you're very thoughtful about how to prioritize. One of my mentors, the founder of Red Ventures, his name is Rick Elias, he talks about prioritization. He says, there's this weird false dichotomy between growth and profitability. Everyone kind of says, well, you can either grow, and he goes, well, I only have a limited amount of time and resources. Why don't I find the initiatives where I can both grow and be profitable and just do those ones? And so his whole view is that it's a failure of thinking, like it's a laziness of thinking. And so what if you think just always that you can be profitable and grow, and only choose those things to work on, and you don't work on the things that don't, that only get you one or the other. So I just wanted it to be more out there, and people think of it as a more viable path and mentality.
Got it. And I can tell you that the Twitter thread is quite popular in our founder community, and I completely resonate with what you're trying to achieve through that. In fact, it sort of goes back to the foundational strategy of philosophy at DSG. Again, as I mentioned, the reason we think consumer brands require a different approach is that our belief is that iconic brands take time to build, and the way we think about delivering venture returns is through capital efficiency as opposed to blitz scaling. And the important thing is, even if a consumer brand takes 3-4 years longer than a tech business to achieve the same scale, but consumes a fraction of the capital in the journey, the returns still add up. And the journey is that much more predictable and manageable when you're pursuing calibrated growth. So
there's another thing for me, by the way, on that point, which is very near and dear to my heart. And if you read about me or see, I also think you can, if you grow that way, you can truly prioritize your people in a way that blitz scaling doesn't allow for. Blitz scaling says, are you the right person in this moment for this job? If so, great, get on board. And 18 months later, I might fire you. And taking a slightly more bootstrapped approach, at least it's a passion of mine, is to grow and develop people, something I care a lot about. And this approach, in addition to being capital efficient and probably better for the kind of defensibility of the brand, also allows you to coach and develop people. And over time, I think that becomes a really powerful force.
No, that's a very interesting point. Completely agree with that. And at DSG, we clearly believe that consumer brands are well suited for capital efficient growth, but would like to understand, how you think about businesses or category characteristics that lend themselves well to capital efficient growth, right? How do you think about that?
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts on that. One fun activity to do, and it's been kind of fun for me because, I've been running a 200-person business for the last several years. But if 10 years ago in 2010, when I started Ampush, I wanted to start an e-commerce business, I would have, probably needed 3 or 4 developers, maybe I could have used one of the CMSs at that time, but they were all pretty shitty, right? I would have needed to figure out payment processing, and that would have taken me time and been very challenging. I would have had to figure, there's the laundry list of, 20 different things. So literally just to get the thing off the ground would have taken me 2 years and probably a few $1 million, realistically. Today, as everybody knows, that stuff, it's all a tech stack now. You light up. For fun, when I first started Gateway X, I said, how fast can I launch a store? And it took me 2 days. 2 days by myself. It was horribly ugly and whatever, but I was able to get a functioning store up and running. Payments is solved, retention is solved, integration with the back. So just how the ease with which you can do it and the low cost of starting costs is dramatic when you think about what it was 10 years ago. I think that's the starting point, which is, okay, well, I don't need, from a capital efficiency standpoint, I just don't need the money and the resources that I used to need to get this off the ground. So what do you need? You need probably a designer, someone who can do some development on Shopify, creative, product, and then probably some media dollars. And on that front, obviously, I have strong opinions. As I think about what works from an economic model perspective, especially from kind of a capital efficiency perspective, it's maybe not that surprising, right? High gross margins. To me, if it's lower than 60%, it's tough to bootstrap it. It's tough to make it capital efficient for a lot of different reasons. Ability to sell multiple months or multiple packages at once, which allows for a certain type of kind of that negative cash conversion cycle. So, that's one. Ideally, some subscription or recurring nature, if not large nominal dollar gross margins. So something that, you're making high gross margin percentage and nominal dollars. And at least in the US, right, and I haven't done a ton in other markets as we talked about, I think you want something where you can really have a great business at a $40 to $60 CAC. And so that's kind of generally the economic model I look for. One area we've identified that we think is compelling is supplements. Supplements we think is a really fascinating category in the US, especially for a variety of different reasons. I think other areas are I'd call them what's the right way to say it? Vanity health stuff. Teeth whitening is very interesting, or tattoo removal is a space that we think is really interesting in the US. We've spent some time in categories that are beauty is pretty busy right now and skincare is pretty busy, but there's certain medicated things going on that we think are very interesting. Generally, telehealth we find to be super compelling. There's a bunch of stuff coming that's still coming, kind of what Hims and these guys did, where something was coming off of patent in the US and they were able to kind of get it up and running from a D2C perspective. Yeah, that's probably, I can talk more. We have a bunch of views on a bunch of categories. That's kind of the starting point.
Oh, understood. No, that's interesting. And, in fact, I just made a blanket statement that consumer brands are ideally suited for capital efficient growth. But, I think our belief is the three important reasons for that is, one is that it's generally not a winner take all outcome in consumer brands. You can always find your niche that you can truly dominate and, not bother about pursuing the winner take all path. The second is, as you mentioned, gross margins being positive on day one. So, if you really want to optimize for profitability and unit economics, you can actually do that. The scale, is not guaranteed, but the fact that you have a product with a positive gross margin just means that, you can actually build a sustainable business. And the last part is that the disruption cycles in consumer brands are just that much longer because consumer brands aren't as exposed to the tech obsolescence risk that tech businesses are. So that just gives you that additional leeway for, relatively patient business building as opposed to, being on your toes and just looking back on what the next disruption is. Yeah. So, no, that was great, Jesse. And, switching gears, would like to now spend the next section on performance marketing. And, one of the biggest levers to ensure capital efficiency for consumer brands is keeping the marketing costs in check. And we're in an environment where all our businesses are dependent heavily on the digital channel. And I was just recently, there was a Facebook quarterly result that came out that spoke about a 30 to 40% year-on-year increase in CPMs, etc. So, I think a good place to start would be on what your advice would be for a new founder. I know you have a very interesting framework on how to approach performance marketing and get to profitable unit economics initially. Would be great if you could walk us through that.
Yeah, sure. And feel free to guide me if there's something specific that you've heard me talk about. But the starting point, oftentimes early founders, what do they do when they're starting a business? They go around and go, well, what should my economics look like? And, one of the things I cringe the most on is when people say, oh, a 3-to-1 LTV to CAC. 3-to-1 LTV to CAC and you're good to go and that's life and you're fine. And what turns out is that's like an extremely arbitrary number. It's just somebody pulled it out or some VC or somebody said, you know what, if that's good, then I'll invest in your company. And the reality of it is, why couldn't it be 5-to-1? Typically you could pick any number, frankly. I mean, those are all output. It's like an output number. It's like, oh, well, what should my EBITDA margins? Well, your EBITDA margins, if you hire less people, could be 30%. If you hire more people, it's 20%. It's all the choices you make. And I think that's the first starting point for performance marketing, is that people who are unfamiliar with it tend to think of it as like gravity, like laws of gravity. And in my experience, it's much more malleable than people realize, right? And let's start with the easiest version of that. There are channels out there that are 100%, or 100-to-1 LTV to CAC. SEO is a good example of that. Email marketing. And so SEO, now the downside of SEO is it takes 2 years, right? And SEO, for those who don't know, search engine optimization, that's when you get your website to rank on Google organically. So someone searches for probiotic for gas, and you're the number one result that is free. Now, of course, that takes content and time and energy and may take you a year. And then maybe the other extreme is I don't know, I'll pick on Facebook, but I like spending a ton of money on Facebook because, next day you can get results, but the economics may not be so great on those results. And there's a wide range in between. There's SEO, there's email, there's brand search, there's affiliate. There's a whole portfolio of choices you can make across the board. And part of the job of the board and the CEO is to go, well, what would be really distinctive economics? And especially if you're not under the pressure to go really fast because you have to keep raising VC, you say, well, maybe I want 2 parts SEO, 4 parts email, and 2 parts Facebook. And that's the right mix for me. And I'm going to see if that works. And I'm going to do some things to get my economics working. And I generally tell founders when they say, oh, should I do 3-to-1 LTV? I go, either don't have a number, because that's going to immediately put a ceiling on your team, because they're just going to deliver the number you ask them to deliver. And they're going to make the choices that are low quality choices and typically, easy choices. Or if you're going to give them a number, give them an insane number, like 5-to-1 or 6-to-1, that's going to force them to make decisions and investments that retain a high bar for the economics of the business, right? That's kind of the high level sort of portfolio approach when it comes to doing marketing. Having done this myself, it's frustrating. We have a couple brands and we're not scaling them yet because their economics aren't quite there yet. Well, email is 5% of our mix right now, and it needs to get to 30% of our mix. And that's frustrating because the subject lines aren't working, and it's not easy, right? So I'm not saying that this is easy stuff and it's just a switch, but I think oftentimes people tolerate and take on mediocre economics and scale mediocre economics. And then that leads to a very huge lacking of capital efficiency in these businesses, right? That's the number one cause of that issue, because it's kind of a weird thing where you can grow at shitty economics. And then, even double clicking on a channel like Facebook, which is obviously the one most people are dependent on, Facebook is a really fascinating channel in that there's the most elasticity of both scale and positive economics on Facebook more than any other channel. And the reason why is, contrast it with Google for a second. If I Google office desk and office chair, everybody else bidding on those keywords are bidding and selling kind of a similar product, right? Can't be that much cheaper or more expensive because we're all kind of bidding on the same asset, if you will. In Facebook land, everyone's bidding on the audience and inventory, and it turns out you can sell multiple things to multiple people. And the way Facebook's math works is think of it as, let's say in the US, again, a $20 CPM. So that's cost per 1,000 impressions. Well, say you spent $200, so you got 10,000 impressions. Whether your click-through rate is, your click-through rate's 0.5%, that means you got 50 people, to click. And your conversion rate is 2%, so you got 1 person to purchase. That costs you $200 to get that CPA, right? If you got 1% to click through, now you got 100 people click through and you got 4% of the people to buy it. Now it costs you $50 per CPA. It turns out Facebook does not actually care what your CPA is. They care all about what they get for every little piece of real estate that they show. So if you can improve the yield of your marketing, what I just did that example, and what I just described is something I see every day. I've seen it at Ampush every day, where somebody walks into us and says, I have a $150 CPA, I'll split the difference with you guys if you guys can improve it. And we, maybe not cut it in half, but we'll reduce it by 60% and make a lot of money in the process. And so Facebook is actually a very malleable channel if you can get, it's just a math problem, by the way, but if you can get that click-through rate and that conversion rate and that yield, we think of it as yield per impression. If you can improve it dramatically, you can actually improve the economics of Facebook quite a bit.
Got it. No, that's very useful. And, this is a tricky question from the founder standpoint, but do you think founders should spend significantly on performance marketing before achieving profitable unit economics?
No.
I hope the founders are listening. And could you just elaborate why?
I mean, because you're just burning money. You can experiment with things, you can try things. The word significant is obviously a vague word. Like, I think, $5 to $10,000 a month, again, in the US is probably a reasonable monthly budget until you've figured out unit economics. And then once you figure them out, and it's like, what I tell everyone is like, get one keyword to work profitably. Nobody's ever gotten 20 keywords or 100 keywords to work profitably at once. That's never happened. So it starts with one, or get one ad that's very engaging I've seen businesses, I kid you not, that you've heard of, if I said their names, that are spending 10, 15 million a year on Facebook. And we get into their Facebook accounts 10 to 50 million in digital, 80% is Facebook. And of the 80% of Facebook, 60% is being spent on one asset, one creative.
Wow.
And oftentimes they're calling us because that creative is no longer performing the way it used to. And they're like, we've been so scared to touch anything that we haven't tested anything. And therefore we have no idea what we're going to do. But the flip of that is one creative, if you find it, people ride it out to build a multi-million-dollar business. And so, I would not spend beyond, again, US numbers, $5 to $10,000 a month until you have positive unit economics.
Got it. No, the message is loud and clear. So part number one is clearly, getting to profitable unit economics. And part number two is, almost as difficult, if not more difficult, where you've cracked the unit economics initially, but subsequently as the business scales, CAC sort of, increases faster than revenue. So what would your advice be in terms of, best practices to ensure that the CAC is under control and, the CAC creep doesn't happen?
Yeah. I would remind everyone that CAC is not I think boards and CEOs oftentimes treat it as a voodoo, like CAC, we must, it's like the weather. It's like, oh my gosh, it started raining today. Like, we truly don't control the weather, right? CAC is very much something that people can control. And oftentimes the reason it creeps is because organizations are not testing and experimenting enough. Here's a simple example, right? If you have a landing page, conversion rate has a half-life. Right. So like, if you have the same conversion rate a year later, half the number of people will convert on it because either they've seen it or it's using last year's like whatever it is, has a half-life, right? And so CAC, creep or whatever, it's not an accident. It's usually because the teams aren't. So anyway, to answer your question, best practices, heavy experimentation, both in channels as well as, in other channels, so testing new channels as well as testing old channels, making significant investments in organic, things. Email is a big one. SEO is a big one. Referral programs are a big one. And, and I think also making sure the company and the culture and the organization don't orient too much towards growth, because again, sometimes growth is easier than economics, and instead they really orient towards economics. That's just a cultural thing. I've seen a lot. People orient to growth, and you'll see people making completely stupid decisions to hit certain subscriber numbers or something.
Right.
Just culturally, that's the thing that's important.
Got it. Would just like to, double click on the experimentation aspect, experimentation and the focus on data. It's something that, we work with our companies on as well, but would like to understand your views on this. Again, the context here is, we're talking about brands that are very young and probably, spending not more than $1-2 million annually and working with very lean teams. Is there a framework that you would suggest in terms of how they should think about experimentation, be it the number of parameters, the number of tests, velocity of tests, etc.? Because there's always this concern that, you might end up boiling the ocean and, getting drowned in data. So, useful.
I think, that's a great question, because I see a lot of teams getting lost in this. I'll throw out a couple just rules of thumb. I think on Facebook, you should be testing 25 to 50 new creative a month and 2 to 4 new conversion and landing experiences per month. So that's just that's an input side, what you should be producing every month. I think the concept testing is actually very expensive because you only have a certain amount of traffic and you can only show it to a certain amount of things.
Right.
And, I think it's important early on, especially to figure out kind of what does a win actually look like? What are you actually aiming for when it comes to a win? Mm-hmm. Right. So we'll use, we use no genius framework, like the ICE framework, which is impact, confidence, ease, which I'm sure most people know, but impact is, all of these should be things that take you 5 minutes to answer. There's no analysis done here. Like impact is, if it works, how big is it? Big, medium, small. Confidence is usually if you've done something like this before and it's worked, high confidence. If you've sometimes had ones work and some haven't, then you're going medium. And if you've never, it's a totally brand new test, then it's low. And sometimes we do 30, 60, 90. And then ease is a cost or timeline thing. How expensive or how is it going to take 10 developers to redo the whole flow? Or is it going to be, just a quick change that we do on the landing page? It's super easy to do. And obviously there's some finesse in like thinking through that. It's not just a math equation, but it's thinking through what to pick there. But I think, I think where a lot of people get caught up is, most companies at this stage should not be testing for significance. They see math. We all love let's do math. Let's get the numbers really right. What's a confidence interval? And there's a time for that. And Ampush does a lot of stuff like that because the scale is a little bit different. At this scale, be testing stuff that's big enough on the impact scale that it's easy to measure whether it worked or not.
Right.
And if you're getting to, the way I one visual I always like to people is like the clay spinning on the wheel. Mm-hmm. Like $1 million media spending business is not a finely crafted piece of clay that you're now digging in and doing the specific thing. It's still like you're chopping off big slices of it and saying so I would make sure your ambition is shooting high enough such mm-hmm. that if it works or doesn't work, and that you're in other words, you're going for 50 to 100% wins. You're not going for 5 to 10% wins. If you're going for 5 or 10% wins, $1 million company, that's going to be a real challenge, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to take home. And one related point to that is that we use this other framework called Champion Challenger, which mm-hmm. is sort of like you have a champion creative or a champion, flow, and you're adding a challenger into a Facebook mix or into a campaign and seeing that actually wins. Like it can overcome the current winner in some way. And that's also a great sign that you're doing something that's so different or so meaningfully better that it's gonna, and if it's not, then you're like, oh, it's not clear that it's the winner and therefore it's not the winner. So that's a kind of a simple version of what I'm saying, just like got to kind of swing big. And it shouldn't be, if you're getting into complex math and stats to prove whether you're probably, probably already lost the game a little bit.
Got it. No, that's really useful. And, the other challenge that businesses face when it comes to performance marketing is that, as you would know, even in the US, it's still an emerging field. And, it's usually a challenge to find solid growth or performance marketeers. So how should founders think of backgrounds, skill sets, personality traits to look for when hiring performance marketeers?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very tough. It is an emerging field. And, with respect to, if you're a marketer on the phone or a traditional marketer, I've never had success. I've had very limited success hiring people from traditional marketing roles and putting them into performance marketing roles. And that's just my experience, right? And so what we've tended to do is we've either hired from investment banking or consulting, or we've hired the same type of person right out of university and trained them. And I think that's tough, but I think step one is probably one of the founders for the first year. If you're going to run a consumer company, I think one of the founders has to spend more than half their time in the first year or two becoming an expert in performance marketing.
Okay.
And
could you say that again? How long?
I think if you're running a brand like this that's a D2C or that relies heavily on it, one of the founders has to spend more than 50% of their time in the first year or two becoming an expert in performance marketing. I don't think an agency will save you. I don't think, these things are pretty fundamental. And, it's like one thing I'll say to founders, oftentimes they'll come to me and they'll have spent a year working on the formulation for the best shampoo ever that detangles your hair and makes it soft. And they'll talk to me about all the chemicals and all of these. And I go, cool, let's talk about performance marketing. Okay, can you give me an agency that's going to take care of that for me, please? And I'm like, wait a second. You told me you spent a year developing the formula for this amazing product. Don't you think you need to spend at least 6 months thinking about which, the dynamics of how the keywords should work or the creative that's going to work on the Facebook? Just to be clear, I'm not saying you have to become a Facebook, you have to know the interface perfectly and lookalikes. You can hire a person that does that stuff, like sitting there, but you have to be able to understand, like, okay, we tested this thing, like, how does this targeting thing work? Why are the click-through rates going up? Why are they going down? Why are we getting links built for our SEO program or not? Which headlines are we using? There's real stuff to understand and know and be able to play with. Otherwise, it's always going to be a black box for you as a founder. And, I've seen many CEOs and founders get in big trouble in one way or the other because this thing is a black box. Their business is highly dependent on it. They don't understand it that well.
Got it. No, that's super helpful, Jesse. And, that was very interesting, the commitment that you said it takes for founders to crack the performance marketing challenge. Just one quick follow-up on that. You said you typically look for talent from investment banking backgrounds, etc. So any recommendations in terms of, training them or resources that you could refer founders to just...
Yeah, there's a ton. I mean, 10 years ago, we built all this stuff ourselves, right? And now there's like Reforge. Reforge is amazing. There's Demand Curve is amazing. There's Twitter, obviously, which has tons and tons of content if you follow the right people. There's like Discords and Slack channels. But those two communities are really good and have, I pay for them. I think they're that good. And I have my people going through them. And then some of it is, again, like the rigor of learning and building and knowledge, which is like, again, someone in the organization has to sit down and say, okay, our CPA is up by 10%. Can somebody explain to me quantitatively how that happened and qualitatively how that happened? Oh, click-through rate is down by 10% and conversion is still flat. Okay, Why is click-through down? Oh, because the creative with the pretty girl is no longer getting the volume it used to. Okay, what are we going to do to triage that? How are we going to solve that problem? Oh, we're going to test 10 other, if that rigor doesn't exist in the organization, one interesting fact I will point out, and I'll be a little careful on this one, but in the US, if you look at meal kits, mattresses, and makeup, the number one player in each space, Blue Apron, Casper, and Birchbox, have all been really, really poorly performed long-term businesses. I think that's generally a fact, right? The second player in each of them, HelloFresh, Purple Mattresses, and Ipsy, they're literally, the market caps are something in the order of 50 to 100 times the first player. And you go, wait a second, there's the same business, literally the same business. How is that possible? The answer is one thing. It's not, I was going to say performance marketing, it's rigor, right? There's the way that those organizations, the second player, the second entrant, they are quantitative, they are rigorous, they're highly accountable organizations. The first guys, my opinion, they all got a little bit lazy, or they didn't build that rigor because they had tons of free first mover advantage. They were the ones that got tons of free customers coming in the door because they were the ones to kind of invent the category. And it actually led them the wrong it led them astray because they didn't build in all the systems and the rigor. And there's almost no other way to explain it because they're the same business. So just think of those across three categories, three stories, and the difference is rigor and performance marketing and culture. And if you know anyone from HelloFresh or that culture, they're the best. But all of them, Ipsy is a really strong. They're very rigorous, analytical. You ask the VP of marketing of those organizations, their channel spend breakdown by channel, they'll tell it to you off the top of their head. You ask them how click-through rate changed and why it mattered, they'll tell you off the top of their head. And that's not because they're doing it, that's because the CEO is asking that question. There's a very clear behavior there that persists throughout those organizations.
No, that's amazing. I knew about the mattress part, but I didn't know about the other two. And love, it's really important, the analytical rigor, and that's something we emphasize a lot as well. We have a few audience questions, so I'll try and just a couple of questions from my end before we take the audience questions. So this discussion is a good segue into the last two questions that I had, which was more on people, culture, etc. So again, stepping back, what do you think are the traits that the founder traits that lend themselves well for capital efficient business building?
Sorry, can you give me a little more color on?
More personality traits or skill sets, etc. What do you think are important if founders want to pursue the capital efficient path?
Yeah, I think personality traits feel a little bit strong because I feel like you can learn anything, but I think it's like there's a certain, tenacity I think is a really important thing, which is sort of this mix of determination and hustle and a bunch of other things. I think being scrappy is really important. I think like having the conviction of like kind of sticking with the kind of like stubbornness to make sure that you're actually delivering good economics before you scale is really important. At the same time, I think like the flip of it is like there's a lot of value in being a tastemaker, being a person who understands what consumers want, how to position things to them, how to get people to click and buy things at the end of the day. Because there's as many stories I can talk about Rigor, but there's plenty of stories where someone just came up with a really good product at the right time and they were also able to bootstrap it because the way that Facebook and all these platforms reward you for that quantitatively also, right? So I think there's a value in being a tastemaker around those things. But ultimately, I think obviously, again, having a good product that people will buy, I think moving quickly, I think being scrappy, thinking about cash flow. Like it's my background's in finance, obviously, but it's just shocking to me how little most founders understand about cash, like actual cash and not statements, but I got paid today and when do I have to pay someone? And what if I pay them 5 days later? Like they just how to manage their own cash.
Right. No, absolutely. And just that is a good lead into the last question that I had, which was on the metrics that founders should monitor to, ensure capital efficiency, right? What do you think are the top 3 metrics that founders should be on top of to ensure capital efficient growth?
Yeah, the number one that I think is this concept of units to break even. How many gross profit multiplied by units divided by overhead or overhead divided, like how many things do I have to sell before I can just pay for my operations? And to me, the equivalent of sort of the burn rate, which is like the VC metric, how many months do I have to be in business? It's like, how many months do I have to figure this out? Like, or can I get there until I'm at a place where, like I always like to say, make $1 in profit a month. If you can make $1 in profit, your business exists forever. You never have to worry about running out of money. And so to me, that units to break even conceptually is super important. The second one is obviously, I have different versions of this, but like it's operating cash flow effectively, right? And particularly trying to drive that number towards, again, 0 or positive, but the difference between that and units to break even is this one. Now you have to think about when you're receiving the money, when you have to pay the money, and what you can do inside of that equation to create space and room for yourself. One of my favorite anecdotes around this is, Jeff Bezos famously only raised one VC round before he went public. And the reason is because he figured out working capital. He was basically taking money up front from people putting their credit cards down and paying his vendors 60 days later. And so growth actually gave him cash.
Right.
And he he didn't burn any cash. He just, as long as he kept growing, he could use the cash from today to pay, and he was able to grow himself very dramatically that way with very little cash. And so, if he did it, we should all do it probably, right?
No, absolutely.
And then the third one is probably just like fixed versus variable costs. I think that's and minimizing overhead, minimizing fixed costs, or trying to push as much as you can to variable costs until you're confident in that first one, which is units break even.
No, that's fantastic. And, in fact, even in our interactions with founders, I think the common thread that I see in all those metrics is the focus on cash flows and being on top of cash flows. And that's something that's not intuitive. And we found founders, struggle to be on top of. P&L metrics are a lot more intuitive, but cash flows metrics, they're not, but it does require some effort. But if you put in the effort and get to a stage where you can forecast and monitor cash flows effectively, it just improves the predictability of outcomes dramatically. In fact,
it's just another lever you could easily optimize for. And one of my hacks I'll actually talk about, which I think is valuable, is just pay attention to your bank account's cash balance.
Absolutely.
That thing does not lie. You can tell yourself whatever you want about your P&L, but if you look at your bank balance and it's down by a lot and you're saying, wait a second, I made you know, no, you didn't. And so you have to start it creates enough curiosity to go, wait a second, what? Well, how did that happen? Like, why is my cash balance this? Right. And I think that's sort of one of the big things I encourage people to spend a lot of time, look at their cash balance.
Correct. And in fact, there's one metric that we encourage all our founders to be on top of. It's simple and powerful. It's what we call the capital efficiency metric. It's our take on ROCE, return on capital employed, that late stage investors and public market investors use. And it's very simple. It's essentially your current revenues divided by the cumulative capital invested in the business so far. And the good zone to be in for consumer businesses is north of 2x on that metric. So for the founders listening in, all it means is if you raised $1 million and spent $1 million in cash, then a good zone to be in is north of $2 million in revenues. And, it's just a simple and powerful metric, but, we've just seen that it really helps both from a planning standpoint, monitoring, etc. We have...
That's a lot nicer metric than I would give.
Yeah, I know. 2 is like bare minimum, but yeah, the next ones, we've seen north of 5, 6x, etc. But yeah, 2s, you have to start somewhere. So, but good to hear that remark from you. We should, think if we should move that up. But anyway, that was on a lighter note, and I think we should shift to the audience question. There are a number of them. So let me just start with the last one first. This is from Siddhant. Hi, Jesse. What's your take on building in-house brand performance marketing teams rather than outsourcing it to agencies? Do you think the foundation and approach is better done in-house? Is it worth the effort? I think you answered this question. I think it's yes to all, right? It has to be in-house, but I'll let you.
One thing I say is like third parties and agencies are not good for rubbing sticks together. They're good at pouring kerosene on the fire, right? So if you've gotten the fire going and you just need someone's outside help for a period of time, then great. Like maybe they can pour some kerosene, but it has to be the kind of thing you're thinking of them as essentially extension of your team and employees or contractors, not as the second they're just some third party black box. I think you lose a lot. So yes, I think foundation and approach has to come from in-house. Just think of it as a form of innovation. I think that's another thing I tell founders. Again, you spend a year innovating your fancy shampoo. Can you not spend 6 months innovating the marketing messaging and the things you're going to put out into the market? That's part of the kind of earning the value of the business you're creating. And so, yeah, I think you started the words, time, and effort as a founder.
Yes. I think we read it out for the benefit of the audience. So because
I was just reading the last question. Is it worth the effort and time a founder has put in the hiring process for this specific team? Yes.
Absolutely. The next one is on brand marketing. At what stage would you suggest brands start considering non-performance marketing? I think essentially the question is about when should one start investing in brand marketing?
Yeah. Hey, one thing I'd like to differentiate, knowing who your customer is and doing the work around customer personas, brand personas, I think is very valuable early on, even for performance marketing. Spending actual dollars on things that are non-attributable. I mean, I'm tempted to say never, maybe at 50 to 100 million in top line, something like that. Like you could start to experiment with it or try. Because ultimately, like if I'm running a TV campaign or a billboard or something that's like, I still would want to try to measure it. Like even when we talk to businesses spending $300 million a year in media, we still say, listen, when you're running brand dollars, are you getting brand search query volume going up? Are more people going to your thing and hitting Google and searching your brand name? Are more people, talking about you on social? And if you put together like what's called a brand recall study, which every quarter you call some segment and you say, so I still tell people you got to measure those 3 things, even at huge scale for brand, because everything needs accountability. I mean, everything needs accountability.
Absolutely. What you don't measure, you can never optimize.
Yeah.
Great. The next one is on, from Abhishek. Yeah, it's a good one. I wanted to ask you this. There's always an anxiety that someone else has raised more money and growing more rapidly without caring about unit economics. How do you tackle this feeling?
Yeah, I think this is where you have to put the Warren Buffett hat on and say, what value do they truly get from growing faster and scaling? Like, is there something fundamentally defensible about the business? And I think most businesses with a 10-year time horizon have multiple winners, as you've said. They don't, there's nothing that really differentiates Schick from Harry's, from Dollar Shave Club, from whoever. And so I think you just have to get comfortable that it's better to build a higher quality business over time. And that there's, again, there's a many winner market. In truly zero sum or winner take all markets, this is not necessarily the case, but we're not talking about those today, right? Yeah. But in these markets, and it's okay to be a multi-winner market, and the market, the business with better economics ultimately will win because it can invest more, because it can scale more as a better culture. And so this pace of growth is not an important metric relative to a competitor, in my opinion, for businesses like this.
Yeah. And to add, Abhishek, in addition, one other factor that works in the favor of consumer brands is just the brand and customer love that you build. We've seen it in our own portfolio, where we had much better funded competitors try undercutting on price, etc. But, our best brands have always been resilient and, have not had to suffer because of that.
Yeah. Right? And I mean, there's one other underlying question here, which is like the feeling, and I won't go into a whole thing around that, but like founder anxiety and founder that's going to be there a lot often. And it's like, there's a whole nother conversation we could have about that. But, meditation is a big part of it. Like my favorite book is The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, which talks a lot about kind of noticing your feelings and emotions and learning how to deal with them. And so that's a whole other part of this, which I think is related. But
no, that'll be the topic of our next fireside chat for sure. So great. The next question is from Sumit. It's on, hi Jesse, very informative session. Are there any long-term strategic initiatives that brands can employ to escape I think we covered it unless, you'd like to.
I mean, I think SEO, email, referral, I think those are three just sort of orthogonal things. And then I think, I've said this before somewhat cheekily, but like rising CPMs mean that the competitive market segment is seeing value out of the impressions. Again, it's not some random force. It's not Facebook just arbitrarily raising their prices. So think of that more as, wait a second, how come they can pay more for an impression and it's making my CPA go up? It's a signal to you, a red flashing light that your marketing is not very good. And so the other way to avoid that issue or to continue to maintain or lower your CPMs is continue to build the experimentation muscle and that analytical rigor muscle in your Facebook, because rising CPMs should not necessarily lead you to rising CPAs if you've built that expertise up.
Yeah, and then as we spoke, Facebook is clearly on a solid trajectory to improve with 30% year on year. So that's a given, and you have to work with that.
But it's just important to remember the market is dictating that, not Facebook. Again, it's not the weather. It's a bunch of other people outside driving up the price of a house, and you have to figure out why that house is worth more to them, and you can't pay that much for it.
Absolutely. The next one is from Vi. This is, how far down the funnel should the performance marketing team be held accountable for? Asking because it's one thing for them to generate low CAC for signups, but it's another for these signups to generate value for the platform.
Yeah, that's a great question. Without knowing the business is a little bit hard to opine on, obviously. Like, I think ultimately you're trying to run a business, and accountability has to flow through the whole thing, in my opinion. And certainly, like, early on when you're small, it has to report into one individual. So if it's like the kind of business where, let's say it's like a mortgage business in the US, well, lots of leads are coming through and they're cheap, but those leads, ultimately the cost per true sale is very high or non-existent. Well, then those leads aren't very good. That doesn't do anyone any good. And then similarly, if the sales team is no good at calling them, so I think there tends to be interlocking accountabilities I've seen between sort of a handoff of a lead to a closing of a sale, but ultimately it's one funnel, and so you have one person at the top on funnels, usually two different people thinking about the different components, but then a ton of working together to figure things out around that. So it's a good question though, and it's a hard problem that I think a lot of people deal with. But in general, the answer is, the leads have to convert. Like, if they're not converting, then what's the point?
Got it. And, I think there's a follow-up question on that, which is whether the head of marketing should work closely with the head of product on this to tackle this.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, the concept of a growth team that Reforge and others have put out there is that, like, the head of marketing should actually own that part of the product. And they should even have engineering resources and somewhat separate from the core product team, because typically marketing stuff gets thrown to the bottom of the barrel when it comes to a prioritization for the product team. And
right.
So the new paradigm is there's a growth engineer and a growth product manager, and all of that reports into marketing and growth. And those people have sort of wide purview over the conversion funnel. So if they're going to, obviously, a lot of young leaders and stuff on this call, you can't hold someone accountable for something that they don't have control over, right? So a big recipe for a mess is improve conversion rate, but go talk to the product guy to deal with that. Like, that's going to be a real challenge for the person who's in charge of it in that way.
Got it. The next question is on spending on celebrities, and what's your view on that? A lot of brands tend to overinvest in celebrities.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It can be very valuable. I would try to cut a variable deal with them, is I guess my best advice. And if you want to take some portion or give them an advance of some portion or something, like, there's a way to get most of those deals done where you can give them and convince them that the upside's actually better and smarter. And
right.
Maybe if you have to write a small check to get them on board or show them you're serious, that's fine. But I wouldn't do anything that can make or break you.
Yeah. And in our experience, we've also seen celebrities, that organically gravitate to certain brands and are willing to actually invest in brands themselves. So,
yeah, that's a great way to do it too. A great sign to do it.
Yeah. Next one is on The spends that you mentioned, Jesse had mentioned emerging DTC brands should spend around 5 to 10K on performance marketing budgets in the US. Can that be defined as a percentage of sales?
I mean, I think that one's a hard one. That's sort of like a starter monthly budget until you've gotten sales scaling, right? So it could be 0 to 50K a month in revenue, maybe is maybe a way to think about it. And then at that point, you're going to start scaling up the media spend.
We have a lot more questions, Jesse. So if it's okay with you, we can go on for another 10 minutes. Is that fine?
Sure.
Great. No, really appreciate it. So the next one is from Jagdish. This is on, can you recommend some strategies that worked in increasing click-through rate and conversion rate?
Yeah, I mean, I could write a book about it probably. At a high level, what I would tell you is that click-through rate and conversion rate, click-through it's really important to catch somebody's eye. Like the math, if you think about the math of a good Facebook campaign in the US, again, it's like 10 million impressions served, 1.5% click-through rate or 1% click-through rate, let's say, which is what, 10,000 people clicking, and then 2% conversion rate or 2.5%, which is like 2,500 people. So out of 10 million people who saw an ad, 2,500 bought it. That's considered a good campaign. So just think about the leverage you have if you could get, one of the early tactics that still works shockingly somehow is, we learned this 10 years ago, is you put a red box around your creative, you're going to see your click-through rates go up. So take your best creative and put a red box around it. Why is red? Because it just catches somebody's eye. It's a very basic thing. Yeah. But when you start to think about capturing somebody's eye and what else could you do to capture someone's eye? Sometimes, in the US, there's this company called Calm that does a really nice job of these kind of like moving images that sort of like, they're sort of weird, but they kind of mesmerize you a little bit. Again, a lot of the American meal businesses do red meat pictures of like raw steak. And Right. It's like, oh, well, again, it's red and it's a little bit it's a little bit strange and eye-catching. So click-through rate is a lot about catching someone's eye. And then of course, having something that's compelling and meaningful once they see it and it fits with the brand persona and all that stuff. Conversion rate's a little bit different, right? Conversion rate is now, okay, I'm here. Now tell me, why does this matter to me? What's important to me? Sometimes there's stuff like creating urgency. There's a really good book. It's actually Charlie Munger, one of his favorite books, called Influence by Robert Cialdini. Yeah. And in it, he talks about, I won't go through all of it now, but he talks about a lot of psychological influence principles.
Biases.
And a lot of it has been applied to marketing and other, fields like sales. But, like one of my favorite ones you wouldn't think of is the consistency principle. Mm. And so consistency principle is like, if I say something, like I say that I'm a healthy person, like I don't want to eat a burger in front of you now because I've said I'm a healthy person. I want to be consistent with my word. And they have an example in the book where they call a bunch of people and they say, are you charitable? Will you donate to the Conservation Society and they get a 2% conversion rate and a $50 average donation. Then they call a separate group and they say, do you care about our community? Do you care about the environment? And they say, yes, I do. Yes, I do. And they go, oh, I'm so glad you said that because I would like a donation. And the rate went up by like 3x and the amount like doubled that people were donating. And so we've put that, an example, we were working at a dog food company and we had a whole like landing page around, are you a good dog owner? But do you care about your dog? Do you love your dog? What's your dog's name? Please type it in. Well, like, don't you want to feed them healthy dog food? And the conversion rate went up 70%.
Right.
So that's one example of one principle. But again, this is the notion of immersing yourself into this stuff to really fully understand it and appreciate it.
No, that's a fantastic book and I highly recommend that as well. Great. The next question is on content marketing. What percentage of the budget should an early stage company spend on content, paid and SEO? I think essentially they're trying to get some high level directional input on, the split between this.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, SEO and content marketing means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So it's, B2B content marketing, B2C. SEO in particular, if that's the question, I'd say you generally want to seed it with 5 or 10 good pieces of content. So it sort of like gets the clock started with Google. But realistically, unless you're going to go fully SEO as a strategy early on, it's probably something you revisit after a year, like after you've got a little breathing room, and then you start to invest more meaningfully in it as a way of like building more long-term defensibility. Some of it also depends on your category and your, if it's super competitive SEO category, maybe you never do it, or maybe you wait a couple of years. If you're building some new category that people are searching that there's not a lot of good results for, then maybe you prioritize that differently depending on what your product is and what you think about the search landscape.
Got it. The next question is on Hi Jesse, for a D2C founder traversing the journey towards being a performance marketing expert. What are the key metrics, knowledge milestones you would reckon are important to achieve reasonable mastery?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would not get academic about it. It's like, can you pull levers and can you get results, right? Like, and if not, then every time you're wrong about something or you don't understand something, go figure out and understand it until you can wake up and say, this is what the things I want to test are. This I want to try this stuff. Does it work? Does it not work? Is it a different targeting thing? Is it different, is it creative? And then, by the way, I've been doing stuff along, and I'm running brands right now, and our conversion rate for one of them is really shitty, and we don't know why exactly. And we're just deductively reasoning through it as to what could be the problem and why it's happening. So I think studying it is important and investing in it is important, but ultimately remember you're trying to grow and scale a business. So it's really just a question of like, can your inputs and your perspective drive the outputs that you expect more often than not? That's how you know you've mastered it.
Got it. The next one is Tanuja. Consumer behavior has changed rapidly, especially since the onset of the pandemic. What are your thoughts in the space of education? How has that impacted education?
I think it's big opportunity, and I think like a huge, multifaceted opportunity. Like I think there's going to be. I think the university will obviously be reinvented in many different ways, especially in the U.S. The mediocre universities are in big trouble. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to learn things and teach things in a way that people didn't think was possible prior to the pandemic. And like, that's a fun space. I think anyone who I know who's in it is having a lot of fun in it right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we're still living in the system that was invented in the Industrial Revolution, at least in K-12. So I think this is the last question from the audience. The rest, I think, had a strong overlap with what we covered. Should premium or luxury brands have a different playbook for performance marketing?
That's a great question. Probably, yeah. I think, there's some of these people have been inventing this term called like performance branding or whatever, which maybe is the most applicable for the luxury or high-end brands. I think you still have to start with the same tactics and the same psychological principles, but maybe putting a red box around your creative is going to look like shit, so you're not going to do that, right? So, but the question is, what would catch somebody's eye? And maybe one of your SKUs is red, and therefore so I think you have to translate it, and that goes for everybody, right? I mean, you can take any of these tactics, but if they're just used randomly, they're going to be weird. And so you want to apply them. That's why it's better to learn the abstract principles and then apply them specifically to your business. So I don't know that I would abandon direct response and Cialdini's principles. I would just figure out like maybe a luxury. The whole concept of luxury goods is someone who's basically the consistency principle, right? They're saying, I am a well-to-do, I've made money in my life and and therefore I now have Gucci or I drive a Benz or whatever. And so like, how do you take that principle and turn it into something that makes people click and convert ultimately? So it's sort of the same math equation, the same general concepts, but you probably have to apply them slightly differently to your business.
No, it's very interesting, especially the red box that you spoke about, because in the offline world, you often have brands having red logos, etc., for precisely the same reason that it catches your eye. And yeah, to me, it's about, as you said, double clicking and understanding the underlying principles that worked in the offline world and what can, be used in the online world as well. So, that's a wrap on the audience questions. One final question from my end. Any common mistakes that you've seen DTC founders make repeatedly, would be great if you can highlight it to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about most of them. I think to double underline them, I think scaling the business before you've gotten your economics working is just an easy way to go put yourself out of business. I've seen a lot of D2C founders go out of business. So, it's easy to do. It's very easy to do because Facebook will happily take your money. So that's an easy one to do. I think the second one, again, is sort of this under investing or kind of just thinking of this as like a box that has to get checked as opposed to something very fundamental, not only to learn the concepts, but also then apply them directly to your business and invent marketing for your business the way you invented the product for your business. That's probably the second one. Third one is probably like too much overhead too fast. Like there's a huge range I've seen $100 million top line businesses that have 20 employees, and I've seen some that have like 150 employees. And how on earth is that actually possible? And like the same business, like how is that actually possible? There's only one way to explain it, right? Which is like bloat and lack of discipline and a bunch of other things. So I think that's the other big one, which is like, and I've seen it at every level. I've seen $1 million people saying, I need another employee to do social media strategy. Like, what? What are you talking about? You don't need 20 people, you need 2 people. And then I've seen, the next level, what I just said, and even the next level beyond that. So I would be, very, very careful and thoughtful about.
Got it. No, super helpful. And it's also where the capital efficiency metric we spoke about kicks in. If you're always having an eye on that, then, you calibrate your investments, etc., based on the scale of the business. But this was fantastic, Jesse. I know it's super late for you, could have gone on for much longer. Thank you for joining us today and hope to do more of this in the future. So really, really appreciate you, staying up so late for this again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good night, guys.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. The next session will begin in half an hour. It's on the journey from seed to scale. We'll see you guys soon.